Moscow, the 21st century. Red Square, the beating heart of the largest country on earth, the gilded showcase of a nation that declared itself reborn. To your right stands GUM, the legendary department store, its 7-story arcade dripping with bohemian crystal chandeliers, its boutiques selling Swiss timepieces and Italian leather goods at prices that would make a Wall Street banker pause. Tourists crowd the cobblestones, smartphones raised, laughter echoing off ancient walls. Children chase pigeons near the Kremlin gates. A street performer plays Tchaikovsky on a battered violin. Everything glitters, everything breathes, everything belongs, unmistakably, to the present. Now take 20 steps to the left, 20 steps, and you have crossed from one century into another, into something that has no name in the vocabulary of the modern world, because the modern world was never supposed to contain it. Before you stands a dark, low structure of polished black labradorite and deep red granite. No windows, no signs, no sounds from within. Guards in ceremonial uniforms stand motionless at the entrance, their faces blank as carved stone. And inside that structure, in the geographic and symbolic center of the capital of a nuclear-armed democracy in the 21st century, there is man, dead, lying there for more than 100 years. You already know this. You have known it since childhood, most likely. It is Lenin. It is the Mausoleum. It is normal, but stop. Stop right here and ask yourself the question that strangely almost nobody asks out loud. Why is this normal? In any other country on the planet, in any other capital city, an unburied human body, state-protected, government-funded, open to public viewing, would be an international crisis. It would violate sanitary codes, religious ethics, and basic human dignity simultaneously. It would generate emergency debates in Parliament, urgent inquiries from international health organizations, and front-page scandals in every newspaper from London to Tokyo. In Russia, it is a tourist attraction, and that collective shrug that, well, we all know about it, is precisely where this investigation begins. Because behind that familiarity, behind that cultural numbness, something's hidden, something that makes government officials change the subject with visible discomfort when journalists push too hard. Something that, more than 30 years after the Soviet Union ceased to exist, continues to be financed, guarded, and maintained with a persistence that borders on the obsessive. This is not a story about history. This is a story about a secret that is hiding in plain sight on the most famous square in Russia, in front of millions of visitors every year. Let us begin with numbers, because numbers, unlike politicians, cannot lie. The price tag of the undead. Every single year, the Russian state spends between 13 and 17 million rubles on the maintenance of a single human body. Read that again. 13 to 17 million rubles annually, without interruption. In years of economic crisis, the money flows. During the pandemic years, when the Mausoleum was closed to all visitors for months, the money kept flowing. There are no budget holidays, no austerity measures, no years where someone in the finance ministry looked at this line item and said, perhaps we can skip this one. These figures are not state secrets. Technically speaking, they have appeared in budget documents and surfaced occasionally in the Russian press, but they have never been prominently publicized, never celebrated, never explained to the tax-paying public in any comprehensive way. Journalists who have tried to investigate the full financial picture have found themselves redirected, stonewalled, or simply ignored. Now here's the detail that should make you sit up straight. The entity that commissions and oversees this work is not the Ministry of Culture. It is not the Historical Museum. It is not any body whose mandate has anything to do with museums, archives, or heritage preservation. The client is the Federal Protective Service, the FSO, the agency whose primary purpose is the physical protection of the President of the Russian Federation and the security of strategic state facilities. Ask yourself this question with complete seriousness. Why is the agency that guards the president of a country also responsible for maintaining the preserved body of a man who died over a century ago? This is not a bureaucratic quirk. This is not a historical accident. This is a policy decision renewed and reaffirmed year after year by people who understand exactly what they are doing. There is a reason, and the reason is not sentimental. The institution with two faces. Most people have never heard of an organization called VILER, the All-Russian Institute of Medicinal and Aromatic Plants. The name sounds harmless to the point of tedium. Plants, medicines, aromas. One imagines white-coated botanists quietly cataloging herbs, perhaps writing papers about the therapeutic properties of chamomile. The reality is something quite different. For decades, VILER has been connected, through channels that are not fully documented in any public record, to one of the most secretive biomedical programs in the history of the modern state, the ongoing preservation of Lenin's body. Within this institutional framework, specialists worked whose names never appeared in peer-reviewed journals. Their methodologies were never taught at medical schools. Their findings were never presented at academic conferences. Their single extraordinary purpose was this: to prevent the body of a man who died in January of 1924 from becoming what the laws of biology dictated it should have become more than a century ago. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. This is a literal description of what these scientists were paid by the Russian state to accomplish. And they succeeded, which is, depending on your perspective, either one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of applied biochemistry or one of the most disturbing. Probably both. Inside the cold chamber, people who have visited the Mausoleum describe almost universally the same experience: the cold, the silence, and something else. An atmosphere that is difficult to name but impossible to ignore. Something that makes visitors instinctively lower their voices and quicken their steps. Something that feels less like entering a museum and more like entering a place that operates according to rules you do not fully understand. Now you will understand why. Inside the Mausoleum, the temperature is maintained at precisely 16.4 degrees Celsius. Constantly, around the clock, 365 days a year. A deviation of even half a degree is detected by automated sensors and corrected immediately. The humidity of the air is held within a range of 80 to 90%. The precision of these environmental controls, according to technical assessments that have circulated among specialists, exceeds the precision of the life support systems aboard the International Space Station. Let that settle for a moment. The International Space Station, a facility where human beings live and work in the vacuum of space, where the difference between a functioning atmosphere and catastrophic failure is measured in minutes, has less precise environmental monitoring than a granite building on a Moscow square where a dead man lies in a glass case. Why? The official answer is preservation of a historical artifact. But this answer has a fundamental problem. No other historical artifact anywhere on Earth requires this level of intervention. Egyptian mummies, thousands of years older, rest in museum display cases at ordinary room temperature and require no annual biochemical treatment. The body in the mausoleum requires what the maintenance staff officially call rehabilitation, the same word used for a patient recovering from surgery every 18 months without fail. Rehabilitation of a corpse. The rules that nobody explains here is a partial list of things you cannot do inside the Lenin Mausoleum or in its immediate vicinity. You cannot photograph the interior. You cannot speak above a whisper. You cannot pause at the body for more than a few seconds. Guards physically redirect visitors who linger. You cannot bring flowers inside. They are accepted only at a designated point outside. You cannot bring religious objects. Multiple documented incidents exist of visitors being escorted out by guards after attempting to make the sign of the cross inside the chamber. Notice the pattern. These are rules that characterize two and only two categories of place in human experience. The first category is the surgical theater, where sterility has life and death medical significance and contamination is the primary threat. The second category is the sacred shrine, a place where ritual rules of conduct before an object of veneration are enforced not by logic, but by tradition, authority, and something that functions, in practice, like religious law. The mausoleum combines both categories into one. It is simultaneously a controlled biochemical environment and a place of enforced reverence, and no one in any official capacity has ever fully explained why the rules are what they are. They simply exist. They are simply enforced, and questioning them in practice produces no answers. The silence of officials. In 2012, a group of Russian State Duma deputies submitted a formal inquiry to the government requesting a detailed justification of the annual expenditures on mausoleum maintenance. The request was procedurally correct. It was politely worded. It asked nothing inflammatory, only for transparency about how public money was being spent. No response was ever received, not a refusal, not a partial answer, not even a bureaucratic acknowledgement that the inquiry existed. It dissolved into administrative silence as completely as if it had never been sent. This did not happen in the 1930s, when asking an inconvenient question could cost a person their freedom or their life. This happened in 2012, in a country with functioning internet access, an independent press, and international observers. In 21st century Russia, the question of what to do with the body of a man who died more than a century ago remains, in practical terms, a state secret. And that silence, that particular deliberate institutional silence, is the loudest thing about this entire story, because governments do not go to this much trouble to protect irrelevant things. They protect things that matter, things that hold power, things whose exposure would change something fundamental about how a country understands itself. Over the next 5 parts of this investigation, we will examine exactly what the mausoleum is protecting, not the body. The body is just the visible surface. Beneath it lies a story of fabricated identities, foreign money, hidden medical records, political imprisonment, and a theory of power so strange that it sounds like mythology until you examine the evidence. The mausoleum was not built on Red Square. It was built inside our heads, and it has been there, quietly working for over 100 years. Every nation needs its founding legend. Every revolution needs its saint. And so the Soviet state manufactured one. For 7 decades, the image was carefully constructed, relentlessly maintained, and aggressively defended. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, son of the Russian soil, voice of the Russian worker, blood and bone of the nation he claimed to liberate. His portrait hung in every classroom, every factory, every government office from Vladivostok to the Baltic coast. School children recited his biography like a catechism. His childhood home in Simbirsk became a pilgrimage site. The story was clean, simple, and deeply, deliberately Russian. There was only one problem with this story. It was a fabrication. Not in the way that all political mythology is simplified or romanticized. Not in the way that hagiography softens inconvenient edges. This was fabrication in the most literal sense, the systematic suppression of documented, archival, verifiable evidence about who this man actually was, evidence that reached the highest levels of Soviet power and was buried there by personal order of Joseph Stalin himself. The truth about Lenin's origins is not a conspiracy theory. It is sitting in the archives. Some of it has been published. And the fact that it remains largely unknown to the general public, the fact that you are almost certainly reading parts of it for the first time right now, tells you everything you need to know about who controls historical memory and why. The woman who found the wrong answer. In 1938, a Soviet writer named Marietta Shaginian was working on an authorized biographical novel about Lenin. She had official permission. She had institutional support. She was doing exactly what the Soviet cultural apparatus wanted, celebrating the great leader through the approved medium of literary biography. She went to the archives, and she found something that nobody had expected her to find. Or perhaps something that somebody had expected but had assumed was buried deeply enough that no authorized researcher would ever reach it. In the genealogical records, carefully preserved in the kind of bureaucratic detail that Russian imperial administration maintained with almost manic thoroughness, Shaginian discovered the identity of Lenin's maternal grandfather, His name was Frul Moiseyevich Blank, later baptized as Alexander Dmitrievich Blank, and a Jewish man from Volyn in what is now northwestern Ukraine, who had converted to Orthodox Christianity and built a life in the Russian imperial professional class. His daughter, Maria Alexandrovna Blank, became Lenin's mother, which means that Lenin, the great Russian revolutionary, the voice of the Russian people, the man whose face adorned every wall of every Soviet institution, was, by the definitions that mattered most in the culture of his time, one-quarter Jewish. Shagin included this finding in her manuscript. The reaction from the highest levels of Soviet power was immediate, visceral, and completely disproportionate to anything that could be described as a rational response to a biographical footnote. Stalin's order: silence absolute. Stalin personally reviewed the situation. The novel was banned. Shagin received an official reprimand from the Union of Soviet Writers, a punishment that, in the context of 1938, was not a slap on the wrist, but a potentially career-ending and, in the worst cases, life-threatening form of institutional condemnation. But the most revealing document from this episode is not the ban and not the reprimand. It is the instruction Stalin issued regarding Shaginyan's discovery. The matter was to be treated as classified. Discussion was prohibited. The words used in the official order, as later reconstructed by historians who examined the relevant documents, amounted to a command to remain in the Russian phrase that translates most directly into English as silent, absolutely. Silent, absolutely. Not this is a private matter. Not this is historically uncertain. Not this is irrelevant to Lenin's legacy. Silent, absolutely. Think about what it takes to make the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, a man who operated with near total control over information, culture, science, and human life, reach for that particular phrase in response to a genealogical discovery. Think about what that reaction reveals about how much this information mattered, about what it threatened. The official image of Lenin as a Russian ethnic archetype was not incidental to Soviet power. It was structural. It was load-bearing. Remove it, and something in the ideological architecture of the entire system shifted in ways that Stalin, who understood power with the precision of a watchmaker, found intolerable. The letter that Stalin refused to read the story deepens further when we examine a document that preceded Shaginyan's discovery by 6 years. In 1932, Lenin's sister, Anna Ulyanova, wrote a personal letter to Stalin. Anna had her own knowledge of the family's Jewish ancestry, and her letter, remarkable for its courage given the political climate of the time, made an argument that was simultaneously simple and radical. She suggested that Lenin's Jewish heritage, rather than being hidden, should be publicly acknowledged. Her reasoning was direct. Given the rising tide of anti-Semitism in Europe and the persistent strains of it within Russia itself, demonstrating that the founding figure of the Soviet state came partly from Jewish roots, could be a powerful tool against ethnic hatred. It could signal at the highest possible symbolic level that Jewish people were part of the fabric of Russian revolutionary history. It was by any measure a thoughtful and humane proposal. Stalin rejected it without engagement. The letter was filed, the information was suppressed, and Anna Ulyanova, who had committed the considerable act of daring to suggest that her brother's full identity be acknowledged, found that the subject was simply closed. This is not the behavior of a government indifferent to a biographical detail. This is the behavior of a government that understood with perfect clarity exactly what was at stake in the management of Lenin's identity, and chose suppression over truth every single time. The other bloodlines they retouched, but the Jewish ancestry on Lenin's mother's side is only one layer of the identity that was systematically obscured. Look at Lenin's father, Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov. Examine the genealogical record carefully. On his father's side, Lenin's paternal grandfather, there runs a line of Kalmyk and Chuvash ancestry from the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe, the communities that inhabited the vast territories between the Volga and the Ural Mountains long before Russian imperial expansion absorbed them. Now look at the official portraits of Lenin, the early ones made from life. Look at the bone structure of the face. Look at the slightly prominent cheekbones, the particular set of the eyes. Then look at the later, officially approved portraits, the ones produced by Soviet artists working under ideological direction. Notice how the facial features soften. Notice how the cheekbones recede. Notice how the image gradually shifts towards something more conventionally Slavic, more easily read as the face of a Russian man. This was not accidental artistic variation. This was systematic retouching, the visual equivalent of Stalin's order to remain silent, absolutely, applied not to documents, but to images. Applied not to archives, but to the public face of the nation's founding saint. And then there is the maternal cultural environment. Lenin's mother, Maria Alexandrovna, came from a household where German was spoken as naturally as Russian. The family read Schiller in the original. They corresponded in German. The cultural formation of the household was essentially German Baltic bourgeois, educated European cosmopolitan in the 19th century sense of that word. Lenin himself was functionally multilingual from childhood, at ease in German, French, and English in ways that went far beyond merely academic facility. His years of European exile in Zurich, in Paris, in London, in Geneva, in Krakow were not years of homesick displacement. They were years in which he was, by any honest assessment, entirely at home. The European who used Russia as a laboratory. This is where the biographical detail stops being interesting merely as genealogical curiosity and starts being important as a key to understanding what Lenin actually did and how he thought about the country he claimed to represent. Consider the psychological portrait that emerges from the full picture of his origins. A man raised in a household that spoke German and read European literature. A man whose maternal grandfather was a converted Jewish intellectual from the western borderlands of the empire. A man whose paternal line carried the steppe ancestry of peoples who had never been entirely absorbed into the Russian cultural mainstream. A man who spent the most intellectually formative years of his adult life in the cafes and libraries of Zurich, Paris, and London, arguing about theory with other European radicals. This man looked at Russia and saw what? Not his homeland, in any emotionally uncomplicated sense, not the soil of his ancestors. In any of the ways that phrase was used by the Russian nationalist tradition, he explicitly despised. He looked at Russia and saw a material condition. A social configuration, a set of objective circumstances that could be analyzed with the cold detachment of a laboratory researcher examining a specimen. Russia for Lenin was the most promising terrain for a historical experiment that had been designed in European libraries. The Russian peasant was not his brother. The Russian peasant was a variable in a theoretical equation. The Russian worker was not his comrade in any felt sense. The Russian worker was a revolutionary force to be mobilized, directed, and, if necessary, expendable in service of a larger historical goal. His associate, Georgy Solomon, one of the old Bolsheviks who later broke with the party and wrote his memoirs in emigration, described conversations with Lenin that carry an unmistakable quality. Lenin's relationship to Russian suffering was that of an observer. When mass death occurred, when famine spread, when entire categories of people were designated enemies and treated accordingly, Lenin's documented response was consistently analytical rather than empathetic. He processed human catastrophe as data. This is not the psychology of a man who loved his country. This is the psychology of a man who had a project, and a country he had chosen to conduct it in. The portrait that was never allowed to be painted here is the composite image that the Soviet state worked for 7 decades to prevent anyone from seeing clearly. Lenin was a man of Jewish, Kalmyk, Chuvash, German, and Swedish ancestry, raised in a German-speaking household, educated in the intellectual tradition of Western European radicalism, most comfortable in Zurich and Paris, who arrived in Russia in April of 1917 with a theoretical framework developed in exile and a practical agenda funded, as we will examine in detail in the next part of this investigation, by a foreign government that wanted Russia destroyed as a military opponent. This is not the Russian people's leader. This is something far more complex, far more interesting, and far more unsettling. This is a man who was, in every meaningful biographical sense, a European intellectual who chose Russia as his experimental subject, who organized from the outside the dismantling of a civilization he had never fully belonged to, who then became, in death, the posthumous national symbol of the very ethnic and cultural identity he had spent his entire adult life transcending. The irony would be almost elegant if the consequences had not been so catastrophic. And the fact that this portrait, documented, archival, verifiable, was suppressed by direct order of the Soviet state and remains largely absent from mainstream historical discussion, even today, tells you something important. The mausoleum does not only preserve a body, it preserves a story. And the story is a lie. Every serious investigation eventually arrives at the oldest and most reliable question in the history of detective work. Follow the money. It is a simple instruction, unglamorous perhaps, less dramatic than ideological analysis or psychological portraiture. But money is the most honest witness in any historical proceeding because money leaves traces, and traces do not revise themselves to suit the political climate of a later decade. So let us follow the money. In the years between 1900 and 1917, Vladimir Ulyanov, the man the world would come to know as Lenin, lived the life of a professional revolutionary in European exile. He moved between Zurich, Paris, Geneva, London, Krakow, and a dozen other cities. He wrote, he argued, he organized, he published newspapers and pamphlets, he convened party congresses. He maintained a network of political contacts stretching from the cafes of Switzerland to the underground cells of the Russian Empire. None of this was cheap. Renting apartments in Zurich and Paris cost money. Printing pamphlets and newspapers cost money. Organizing party congresses, renting halls, paying for travel, covering accommodation for delegates costs money. Maintaining a full-time political staff, however small, costs money. Building and sustaining an international courier network cost money. Lenin had no job. He had no salary. He had no inheritance of meaningful size. He was, by any conventional economic description, a professional, unemployed man living in expensive European cities and somehow funding a continent-spanning political operation for nearly 2 decades. Where did the money come from? The official Soviet answer was donations from sympathetic workers, proceeds from party fundraising, contributions from wealthy Bolshevik supporters. This answer is technically not entirely false, but it is, in the way that carefully selected partial truths always are, profoundly misleading. Because the documentary record, including documents that emerged from German state archives after the First World War and additional materials that surfaced after the Soviet collapse, tells a story that is considerably more specific, considerably more disturbing, and considerably harder to dismiss. The man with the plan. To understand how the Russian Revolution was financed, you need to understand one man who is almost entirely absent from popular historical memory, despite being one of the most consequential political operators of the early 20th century. His name was Israel Lazarevich Helphand. He's known to history by his revolutionary pseudonym, Parvus. Parvus was, in the most precise sense, a political entrepreneur, a man who understood that ideology and commerce were not opposites but partners, and who operated at the intersection of radical politics and international finance with a fluency that left even his contemporaries unsettled. He had been associated with the revolutionary left for years, knew Lenin personally, and had connections reaching deep into the German political and financial establishment. In 1915, in the middle of the First World War, when Germany was locked in a catastrophic 2-front conflict against both France and Britain in the West and the Russian Empire in the East, Parvus went to the German Foreign Office with a proposal. The proposal was breathtaking in its audacity and coldly logical in its structure. Russia, Parvus argued, could be knocked out of the war, not by military force. The German army had been trying that on the Eastern Front with enormous cost and limited success. Russia could be knocked out from the inside by revolution, by the deliberate destabilization of the Russian political system through the activation of radical political forces that already existed within the empire and among the exile communities of Europe. The cost of this operation, Parvis estimated, would be approximately 1 million German marks. 1 million marks to end Russia's participation in a world war that was consuming hundreds of thousands of German lives and threatening to break the German state entirely. Measured against the cost of a single week of conventional military operations on the Eastern Front, this was not an investment. It was a bargain. The German Foreign Office agreed. The Copenhagen machine. The mechanism through which German imperial funds reached the Bolshevik treasury was not a simple wire transfer. It was an elaborate structure of commercial camouflage, a financial architecture designed to make government money disappear into legitimate-seeming business activity and reemerge as revolutionary funding without leaving a traceable direct line. The centerpiece of this structure was a trading company established in Copenhagen, a city in neutral Denmark, perfectly positioned geographically and politically as a conduit between the warring powers. The company traded in goods that had obvious legitimate commercial value: medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, food products. The business was real enough to generate paperwork, maintain accounts, and satisfy the superficial scrutiny of anyone who happened to look. The profits were not real in any commercial sense. They were generated, transferred, and directed according to political instructions from Berlin, not according to the logic of the market. From Copenhagen, through a series of intermediary transactions and organizational accounts, funds reached the Bolshevik Party's operational budget. They paid for printing, they paid for travel, they paid for the organizational infrastructure of a revolutionary movement that was, in the language of modern intelligence analysis, a foreign-sponsored operation against a state at war. The German Foreign Office documents that survived the war, and that historians like the German scholar Fritz Fischer examined in the 1960s, triggering a historical controversy in Germany that lasted for decades, contain explicit references to these transfers. They are not complete. They are not a perfect paper trail from Berlin to Lenin's desk, but they are real documents in real archives bearing real official stamps and signatures. They describe, in the dry, bureaucratic language of wartime administration, the deliberate purchase of a revolution. The sealed train. In April of 1917, the Russian Tsar had already abdicated. The provisional government, a fragile coalition of liberals and moderate socialists, was attempting to hold the country together while simultaneously honoring Russia's military commitments to its allies in the ongoing war. Lenin was in Zurich, stranded in a sense. The war had made normal travel between Switzerland and Russia effectively impossible, and the provisional government controlled the obvious routes home. The German military command solved this problem. A special train was organized, sealed, in the diplomatic sense that it was given extraterritorial status, meaning that German authorities would not board it or inspect its passengers. This was the famous sealed train, or more accurately, the plumbed carriage, while it carried Lenin and a group of approximately 30 other Bolshevik exiles from Zurich through Germany, across the Baltic, and into Russia. Think about what this means in practical terms. Germany was at war with Russia. German soldiers were dying on the Eastern Front in a conflict against the Russian state. And the German military command, with the direct authorization of the German High Command, arranged, facilitated, and provided safe passage for the leader of a revolutionary movement that was explicitly committed to overthrowing the Russian government and withdrawing Russia from the war. This was not an act of ideological sympathy. Germany had no interest in Bolshevism as a political system. Germany had one interest: ending the war on its eastern border so that it could concentrate its military resources against France and Britain in the West. Lenin was the instrument. The sealed train was the delivery mechanism. Winston Churchill, writing about this period years later, with the combination of rhetorical brilliance and historical insight that characterized his prose at its best, captured the operation in a single, unforgettable sentence. He wrote that the German authorities had transported Lenin into Russia like a plague bacillus. The metaphor is precise and deliberate. A plague bacillus is not an ally. It is a biological weapon, something you introduce into an enemy organism not because you share its goals, but because you want to watch the organism collapse. Germany did not want to live under Bolshevism. Germany wanted Russia to die from it, and Russia did. The traitor's dossier. Here's the detail that tends to be omitted from the conventional narrative of the Russian Revolution's first chapter. When Lenin arrived in Petrograd in April of 1917 and delivered his famous speeches from the armored car at the Finland station, he was not greeted by the provisional government as a returning political figure. He was, within weeks, the subject of a criminal investigation. The provisional government's counterintelligence services had been tracking the German funding connections. They had accumulated materials. In July of 1917, following the failed Bolshevik uprising known as the July Days, the government moved to act on this investigation. Lenin was publicly accused of receiving German funds and acting as an agent of a foreign power at war with Russia. The charge in the legal terminology of the time amounted to high treason. The evidence, while not complete, was serious enough that even some members of Lenin's own party initially distanced themselves from him in the immediate aftermath of the accusation. The revolutionary press turned on him, at least temporarily. His reputation, which had been rising rapidly since his return, suffered a sharp reversal. Lenin's response to the criminal investigation was not to present himself before the authorities and contest the charges. His response was to disappear. He fled Petrograd. He hid first with a local sympathizer, then in a more famous location, a makeshift shelter near the village of Razliv, outside the city, where he lived in a primitive hut while the investigation attempted to locate him. The romanticized Soviet version of this episode presented the hut at Razliv as a heroic period of revolutionary preparation. The leader studying, writing, preparing for the final push to power, while his enemies hunted him. The less romantic version is simpler. A man accused of treason in wartime went into hiding rather than face the legal process. He emerged from hiding in October of 1917 when the provisional government had weakened sufficiently for the Bolshevik seizure of power to succeed. The investigation was never completed. The government that had opened it no longer existed. The documents were absorbed into archives that the new Soviet state controlled absolutely. And for the next 70 years, the question of who paid for the Russian Revolution was officially answered with a story about workers' donations and party fundraising. What the money means. There is a larger question underneath the financial history. It is not merely a question about accounting or espionage or the mechanics of political funding. It is a question about legitimacy. The revolution that reshaped 1/6 of the Earth's surface, that determined the fate of hundreds of millions of people across the 20th century, that established the political and ideological framework within which 2 generations of Soviet citizens were born, lived, and died. Was this revolution an authentic expression of Russian popular will, or was it a foreign-sponsored operation delivered like a plague bacillus into a country weakened by war and political instability by a man who was simultaneously a genuine ideological radical and a functional asset of German imperial intelligence? The honest answer, supported by the documentary record, is both. These things are not mutually exclusive. Lenin believed what he believed. The German government had its own reasons for enabling him. The 2 agendas overlapped at the critical moment of 1917, and the collision of those overlapping agendas produced an event that neither party fully controlled and neither party fully predicted. But the overlap is real. The money is real. The sealed train is real. And the fact that a man charged with high treason by a legitimate government, charged with taking foreign money to undermine his own country in wartime, ended up not in a prison cell but in a glass case in the center of Moscow, as the sacred founding figure of a state that lasted 70 years and whose shadow stretches across the present, is perhaps the most remarkable irony in the history of the 20th century. The revolution was paid for. The question of what that payment bought and who is still paying the interest grows darker with every part of this investigation. There is an image so deeply embedded in Soviet cultural memory that it achieved the status of visual reflex rather than conscious thought. Grandfather Lenin, Dedushka Lenin, The kindly, balding, slightly round-faced man with the warm eyes and the gentle smile, crouching down to the level of a small child, listening with patient attention. This image appeared in children's books, on classroom walls, in illustrated primers given to first-grade students across 11 time zones of the Soviet Empire. It was the face of benevolent authority, of revolutionary warmth, of a man who loved children and workers and simple people and wanted nothing more than their happiness and liberation. It was, in the most clinical sense of the word, propaganda, not simplification, not selective emphasis, not the inevitable romanticization that attaches itself to founding figures in any political tradition. Propaganda, deliberate, systematic, constructed in direct contradiction to a documented reality that was, from the very beginning, carefully hidden in restricted archive collections accessible only to the most senior party officials. Because the documented reality of Lenin's relationship to human life, to specific individual human lives, to masses of people whom he designated as enemies or obstacles, or simply as raw material in his historical experiment, is not the story of a kindly grandfather. It is something considerably more disturbing, and the evidence is not speculative. It is written in Lenin's own hand, in documents that have now been partially published, and that sit in the Russian State Archive waiting for the researchers willing to look at them without flinching. The telegram to Penza, August of 1918. The revolution has been in power for less than a year. The civil war is intensifying. The Bolshevik government is under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. White army forces, foreign intervention, peasant uprisings in the countryside. From his office in the Kremlin, Lenin sends a telegram to party officials in the Penza region, where a peasant rebellion has broken out. The telegram is brief, it is direct, and it has been authenticated by historians who have examined the original document in the Russian State Archive. Lenin instructs the recipients to suppress the rebellion through an explicit method. He uses the word hang, not as a general instruction, not as a metaphorical expression of urgency, but as a specific operational order. He specifies that the action must be carried out. He sets a minimum number, not fewer than 100 people, designated as kulaks, the category of relatively prosperous peasants that Bolshevik ideology had identified as class enemies. He adds, in what appears to be a moment of particular emphasis, the word necessarily. The hanging must be done necessarily without fail, so that the population can see it. Read this with the attention it deserves. This is not a military commander ordering his troops to fight. This is a head of government sitting in his office writing specific instructions about the minimum number of people to be publicly executed in a rural district, and adding the word necessarily to make certain his instructions are not diluted by any impulse toward restraint on the part of the local officials receiving them. The man who wrote this telegram is the man whose smiling portrait was placed on the walls of children's classrooms across a continent. The letter about Shuya. 4 years later, in 1922, a different crisis provided a different documentary window into Lenin's relationship with human suffering and political calculation. A famine was sweeping Russia, one of the most catastrophic in the country's history. Millions of people were dying. The situation was acknowledged even by the Soviet government, which was accepting foreign aid from international organizations. In the city of Shuya, a conflict had erupted between local authorities and the Russian Orthodox Church over the seizure of church valuables, gold and silver religious objects that the government intended to convert to cash for famine relief. The church resisted. There were protests. Lenin wrote a secret letter about the Shuya situation to the Politburo. The letter, which remained classified until the 1990s and was first published in a Russian historical journal in 1990, is one of the most extraordinary documents in the archive of the 20th century. Lenin's analysis of the famine is not humanitarian, it is tactical. The famine, he writes with unmistakable clarity, creates a favorable political opportunity. When people are starving, resistance to government authority weakens. The population is too desperate for survival to organize effective opposition. This is precisely the right moment, Lenin argues, to move decisively against the church, to seize its valuables, to break its institutional power, and to prosecute its leadership. He goes further. He argues that the more representatives of the clergy who can be brought before courts and sentenced, the better. He frames this not as religious persecution, but as revolutionary necessity. The tone throughout is that of a man discussing the optimal conditions for a laboratory procedure. Clinical, detached, focused entirely on outcomes, and not at all on the human beings who constitute the material of the experiment. The famine that was killing millions of Russian people appears in this document not as a tragedy, but as a tool. The man who foamed at the mouth, Georgy Solomon, was one of the old Bolsheviks, a man who had known Lenin personally for years, worked with him in the revolutionary underground, and eventually broke with the Soviet regime and spent the rest of his life in emigration. His memoirs, written in the 1920s and published abroad, contain observations about Lenin's psychology that are remarkable precisely because they come from a committed revolutionary who had no motive to slander the man he was describing. Solomon describes arguments with Lenin, the kind of intense ideological disputes that were constant in Bolshevik political culture, and he describes something that happens to Lenin physically in the course of these arguments. When Lenin encounters opposition, he cannot immediately overcome by the force of his logic. The description is striking. Solomon writes of Lenin's face changing color, of his hands gripping the edge of whatever surface was nearest, of something appearing at the corners of his mouth, foam, Solomon specifies, using a word in Russian that carries no ambiguity, and of a quality in Lenin's eyes during these moments that Solomon, searching for language, compares to the expression he had seen on the faces of people experiencing epileptic episodes. This is a first-hand description from a political ally, not an enemy, not a czarist propagandist, not a hostile journalist, a man who believed in the same revolution, who had spent years working alongside this person, who, precisely because of that proximity, had the opportunity to observe what official portraits never showed and what official biographies never mentioned. What Solomon is describing is not passion. It is not the intensity of a committed revolutionary. It is something neurological, something that belongs in a medical history rather than a political one. And this observation from the 1920s connects with uncomfortable precision to what we now know about Lenin's medical situation, which is where this investigation becomes genuinely strange. The medicine that told the truth, Lenin's official medical history, as recorded by the Soviet state and later published in sanitized summaries, attributed his declining health in the early 1920s to arteriosclerosis, the hardening and narrowing of the arteries that produces strokes and progressive neurological deterioration. This diagnosis was presented as straightforward. A man in his early 50s with a history of intense intellectual and political stress, suffering the consequences of circulatory disease. Tragic, but medically unremarkable. There is a problem with this explanation. Among the treatments administered to Lenin during his illness, documented in medical records that were partially declassified after the Soviet collapse, appears a drug called salvarsan. Salvarsan was not a cardiovascular medication. Salvarsan was not used to treat arteriosclerosis. Salvarsan had essentially one clinical application in the medical practice of the early 1920s, and that application was specific, well-established, and completely unambiguous. Salvarsan was the primary pharmaceutical treatment for syphilis. It had been developed in 1910 by the German chemist Paul Ehrlich specifically for this purpose. It was, in fact, one of the first targeted antimicrobial drugs in medical history, celebrated precisely because it attacked the syphilitic bacterium with a selectivity previously unknown in pharmacology. Doctors who write arteriosclerosis in the official record do not administer salvarsan. Doctors who administer salvarsan are treating something else, something they cannot or will not write in the official record. The gap between what Lenin's physicians wrote and what Lenin's physicians prescribed is not a minor discrepancy. It is a diagnostic confession hidden in plain sight within the pharmaceutical record. The German specialist and the locked files among the physicians brought in to treat Lenin as his condition deteriorated was a German neurologist named Ottfried Förster, a specialist whose particular area of expertise was, with almost poetic precision, infectious neuropathology, the diseases of the nervous system caused by microbial infection. Förster spent extended periods at Lenin's bedside. He kept detailed clinical notes, as any serious specialist would. He was present for observations and examinations that would have provided the most direct available evidence about the true nature of Lenin's neurological decline. His notes are in the special collection, the Spetskran, of the Russian State Archives. They have not been published. They have not been made available to independent researchers in any comprehensive form. They sit decades after the Soviet collapse behind the same institutional wall that has protected the most sensitive materials from the entire Soviet period. Ask yourself why the clinical notes of a German neurologist treating a man who has been dead for over a century require this level of protection. The answer that presents itself when you consider it in the context of everything else we know about Lenin's medical history is not reassuring. The academician who died 24 hours later. And then there is the case of Vladimir Bekhterev. Bekhterev was not a peripheral figure in Russian medical history. He was one of the most eminent neurologists and psychiatrists in the country. A scientist of international reputation, the founder of the St. Petersburg Psychoneurological Institute, a man whose work on brain physiology and reflexology placed him among the leading researchers in his field anywhere in the world. In late 1927, 3 years after Lenin's death, Bekhterev was in Moscow to participate in a medical congress. During this visit, according to accounts that circulated in Russian medical and intellectual circles for decades afterward, Bekhterev was asked to consult on a patient. The patient, it was said, was Stalin. After the consultation, according to these accounts, Bekhterev made remarks to colleagues, remarks that were overheard or reported or somehow reached the wrong ears. The remarks concerned a diagnosis. The diagnosis, according to the accounts that have survived in memoir literature and historical reconstruction, involved the words syphilis of the brain, applied not to Stalin but to Lenin, whose case files Bekhterev apparently had access to or knowledge of. Within 24 hours of making these remarks, Vladimir Bekhterev was dead. The official cause of death was food poisoning. He was 70 years old, which is not an implausible age for a natural death. Food poisoning is a real medical condition. The timing could be coincidence. The connection could be the product of retrospective pattern matching by people disposed to see conspiracy everywhere. All of this is true. It is also true that one of Russia's most eminent neurologists, with apparent knowledge of Lenin's true medical history, died suddenly within 1 day of speaking about that knowledge, at a moment when the political stakes of that knowledge were extraordinarily high, and when the man who had the most to gain from its permanent suppression was the same man Bekhterev had just examined. History does not always provide clean proof. Sometimes it provides only the geometry of events, the shape of what happened, the timing, the identities of the people involved, and leaves the reader to decide what that geometry suggests. The geometry here is uncomfortable. What the brain revealed after Lenin's death in January of 1924, his brain was removed, preserved, and subjected to extensive scientific examination. A special institute, the Moscow Brain Institute, was established specifically for this purpose. German neuropathologist Oskar Vogt was brought in to lead the analysis. The research continued for years. The official findings, published in a form approved by Soviet authorities, concluded that Lenin's brain showed evidence of severe arteriosclerotic damage with significant deterioration in specific regions associated with higher cognitive function. The physical evidence of strokes was present and undeniable. What the official findings did not address, what the full research record, to the extent it has ever been examined by independent scholars, has never been comprehensively published, is whether the pattern of damage was consistent only with arteriosclerosis, or whether it was also consistent with something else, something that salvarsan was prescribed to treat. something that Förster, the infectious neuropathologist, was brought from Germany to examine, something that Bekhterev apparently spoke about once and only once. The brain of Vladimir Lenin sits presumably somewhere in the Moscow Brain Institute. The complete research record sits in restricted archives. The full medical history of the founding figure of the Soviet state, a man whose preserved body is maintained at public expense by the security services of the Russian Federation, remains over a century after his death, classified. Not all of it, enough of it to know that the official story is incomplete. Enough of it to know that the kindly grandfather on the classroom wall was something quite different in the room where he worked and the body that carried him through the world. The image was always a construction, and constructions, no matter how carefully maintained, like the body in the mausoleum itself, require constant, expensive, deliberate work to keep from revealing what lies beneath. There is a particular cruelty that does not announce itself with obvious drama. It does not arrive with loud declarations or theatrical confrontation. It arrives quietly, bureaucratically dressed in the language of medical care and revolutionary responsibility. It arrives as concern, as protection, as the solemn duty of loyal comrades to preserve the health of their irreplaceable leader. This is the cruelty that was administered to Vladimir Lenin in the final 18 months of his life. By December of 1922, Lenin had already suffered 2 significant strokes. His speech was impaired, his right side was partially paralyzed. His capacity for sustained intellectual work, the thing that had defined his entire adult existence, the tool with which he had built everything he built, was deteriorating with merciless consistency. The man who had commanded the attention of an empire from a sealed train carriage, who had argued theory with European intellectuals across 3 languages simultaneously, who had dictated the political architecture of a new state from first principles, was now struggling to form complete sentences. He was 52 years old. And into this medical situation, into the space created by his physical vulnerability, stepped Joseph Stalin with the precision and patience of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. In December of 1922, the Central Committee of the Communist Party passed a resolution that, in the dry procedural language of Soviet governance, established something that had no precedent in the political history of any modern state. Stalin was given formal authority over Lenin's treatment regime, not his political portfolio, not his correspondence files, not his administrative responsibilities. Those had already been effectively transferred as his health declined. Stalin was given authority over the medical management of a living human being, over who could visit him, over what information could reach him, over what and who was kept away. In practice, this meant something very simple. Stalin now controlled the only thing Lenin had left, his access to the world. The newspaper that was printed for one reader. Consider this detail with the attention it deserves, because it reveals with extraordinary clarity the precise nature of what was being done to Lenin in the Gorky estate where he was confined under medical supervision. A special edition of Pravda, the official Soviet newspaper, the primary instrument of mass political communication in the new state, was prepared and printed specifically for Lenin, 1 copy, every day, for one reader. This edition was not identical to the edition distributed to the rest of the country. It was curated, edited, stripped of information that the people managing Lenin's treatment regime had decided he should not receive. Major political developments were omitted. Conflicts within the party leadership, conflicts in which Lenin himself was a central figure whose outcome would determine the future of the country he had created, were simply absent from the pages placed in front of him. Lenin was reading a newspaper about a country that did not exist, a sanitized fiction printed fresh each morning and delivered to a sick man in a room in the countryside outside Moscow, designed to prevent him from understanding what was actually happening in the political reality he had built. The effort required to produce this, the daily editorial decisions, the coordination between the medical staff and the political apparatus, the maintenance of the fiction across months, speaks to the seriousness with which Stalin's team approached the management of their most dangerous problem, because that is what Lenin had become by the end of 1922. Not a leader, not a symbol, not even primarily a patient. He was a problem, and problems require management. The testament that went nowhere. Lenin knew something was wrong. Even through the fog of neurological deterioration, even with his access to real information systematically controlled, he perceived the shape of what was happening around him with enough clarity to attempt a response. Between December of 1922 and January of 1923, in the intervals between strokes when his capacity for dictation partially returned, Lenin composed what historians have come to call his testament, a document addressed to the party Congress assessing the senior leadership of the Bolshevik Party and making specific recommendations about the future direction of the state. The document is extraordinary in several respects. It is lucid in a way that makes the medical record of its composition almost unbearable to read. A man dictating against the clock of his own disintegrating brain, trying to use the last functioning hours of his political intelligence to shape events he could feel slipping beyond his control. And at the center of the testament, stated with an explicitness that left no room for diplomatic interpretation, was a single recommendation about Joseph Stalin. Lenin wrote that Stalin had concentrated too much power in his hands. He wrote that Stalin was too crude, using a Russian word that carries connotations of coarseness, of a quality incompatible with the responsibilities of the highest office. And he wrote in language that constitutes perhaps the most consequential political recommendation never acted upon in modern history, that Stalin should be removed from the position of General Secretary of the party. The document was dictated. It was typed by secretaries. It was sealed and addressed to the Congress. It did not leave the room in Gorky. The secretaries who took Lenin's dictation were reporting to the political apparatus that managed Lenin's treatment regime. The document was known before it was finished. Its contents were assessed, managed, contained. When Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, attempted to ensure that the testament reached its intended audience, she encountered resistance at every level of the party structure that Stalin was, by this point, effectively controlling. The testament was eventually read aloud at a closed session of the Party Congress in 1924. After Lenin's death, when its political force had been reduced to historical curiosity rather than actionable instruction, Stalin survived. The document was suppressed from wider circulation for decades. Its existence was not publicly acknowledged in the Soviet Union until the Khrushchev era. Lenin's last coherent political act produced no political consequences. He had been neutralized completely. The insult and the impotence. There is one episode from this period that cuts through all political analysis and reveals the human dimensions of Lenin's captivity with particular sharpness. Stalin and Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, who had been his political companion and personal partner for decades, had a confrontation in late 1922. The precise content of what Stalin said to Krupskaya in this confrontation has been reconstructed from multiple accounts, and while the exact words vary between sources, the substance is consistent. Stalin threatened her. He spoke to her with a contempt that went beyond political disagreement into something more personal, more deliberately degrading. Krupskaya, shaken by the encounter, eventually told Lenin what had happened. Lenin's response, his attempted response, tells you everything about the situation he was in. He dictated a letter to Stalin demanding an apology. The letter exists. It has been published. In it, Lenin states that he considers Stalin's treatment of Krupskaya a personal offense, and that if Stalin does not apologize, he will sever all personal relations between them. This is the language of a man who still believes he has agency, who still believes that his words carry the weight they once carried, that a demand from Lenin is something that must be answered, that a threat from Lenin is something that must be taken seriously. Stalin did not apologize, not in any meaningful sense. He sent a response that was technically a statement of regret, but contained in its tone and construction the unmistakable quality of a man who knows he does not actually need to apologize. because the person demanding the apology has no means of enforcing the demand. Lenin was unable to do anything more. Another stroke followed. The window of lucidity that had produced the letter closed. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with the silence of a man who had run out of the physical capacity to continue fighting. This is what political captivity looks like when it is administered with maximum efficiency. Not chains, not an obvious cell, a country house, medical staff, a daily newspaper, and absolute impenetrable control over the one thing that makes a political man's existence meaningful, his connection to political reality. The request that was refused at some point during the final period of his illness, the exact timing is uncertain, reconstructed from accounts that surfaced decades later. Lenin made a request to Stalin. The request was for poison, specifically according to the accounts that have entered the historical record through multiple independent sources, including references and documents from the period and later testimony by people with proximity to the events. Lenin asked for potassium cyanide. He asked to be allowed to die on his own terms at a moment of his own choosing rather than continue the slow dissolution that his illness was imposing on him. The request was refused, and the reason it was refused, the reason that Stalin gave, according to the accounts, is the most revealing detail in the entire story of Lenin's final years. Stalin refused not out of sentiment, not out of any residual personal loyalty to the man he was systematically neutralizing, not out of moral principle or political idealism or any of the qualities that revolutionary biography traditionally attributes to the leaders of historic movements. Stalin refused because a living Lenin, however diminished, however impaired, however incapable of actual political function, was more useful than a dead one. A living Lenin, breathing, present, theoretically capable of recovery and return, could not be replaced. His authority could not be transferred. His name could not yet be converted into the kind of sacred legacy that belongs exclusively to the dead. While Lenin lived, the question of succession remained technically open. While Lenin lived, no one could claim his mantle with complete finality. Dead, Lenin would immediately become something much more powerful, a symbol, an icon. The founder whose memory could be invoked, interpreted, controlled, and weaponized by whoever managed to position themselves as his truest heir. Stalin was already planning for that future. He needed to be the man standing closest to Lenin when Lenin died, the loyal comrade, the devoted servant of the revolution's founder, the natural successor designated by proximity and devotion rather than by any document or formal process. A Lenin who died by his own request in a manner suggesting despair or resignation complicated this narrative. A Lenin who died naturally after a prolonged illness during which Stalin had managed his care with apparent dedication. This was the death that served Stalin's purposes. So Lenin was kept alive, not for his sake, for Stalin's. He died in January of 1924 at the Gorky estate, in a room he had not chosen, at a time he had not chosen, in a manner he had explicitly asked to be spared. The man who visited Moscow in October, and then there is the matter of the October visit. In October of 1923, several months before his death, at a point when his medical records describe a condition of severe incapacitation with profound motor impairment, significant speech difficulties, and documented inability to sustain basic physical activity. Lenin reportedly made a visit to Moscow. He was seen, according to official accounts, in the Kremlin. He toured several rooms. He inspected spaces. His presence was noted. The visit was recorded. Examine this claim against the medical record of his condition at that specific period. Specialists who have studied the documented progression of Lenin's illness have noted a significant problem of consistency. The physical capabilities attributed to Lenin in the accounts of the October Moscow visit do not correspond to the capabilities described in the contemporaneous medical records. A man who was documented as requiring assistance for basic movement, who had severe right-sided paralysis, who was recorded as unable to perform the physical activities that the Moscow visit would have required, This man, according to the official account, made an unassisted tour of Kremlin facilities. The discrepancy has attracted the attention of researchers over the years, and it has generated a theory that sits at the extreme edge of historical speculation, but refuses to disappear entirely from serious discussion. The theory involves a physical double, a man sufficiently similar in appearance to Lenin to pass for him at the kind of carefully controlled, briefly conducted, politically managed visit that the October appearance represented. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial, built from the medical inconsistency, from comparative analysis of photographs of Lenin's ears before and after his illness, and from the documented Soviet practice of using doubles for other leaders in other circumstances. The evidence against it is the inherent implausibility of such an operation, and the absence of any direct testimony confirming it. What is not circumstantial is the discrepancy itself, the gap between what the medical record says Lenin could do and what the official account claims he did in October of 1923. That gap is real. What fills it is, perhaps, the deepest mystery of his final months. The cage and its architecture step back from the individual details and look at the full structure of what happened to Lenin in his final 18 months. A man is incapacitated by illness. Control over his environment is formalized through an official party resolution and placed in the hands of his most dangerous political rival. His access to information is filtered through a daily fiction disguised as a newspaper. His political correspondence is controlled. His most important final political document fails to reach its destination. His request for agency over his own death is denied for reasons of political calculation, and the circumstances of his final months, including at least one public appearance that may not have been what it appeared, remain over a century later incompletely explained. This is not the story of a dying man receiving care. This is the story of a dying man being managed systematically, deliberately, with extraordinary political sophistication, by someone who understood that the most valuable political asset in Russia at that moment was not power, not money, not military force. It was the body and the name of Vladimir Lenin. Stalin controlled both while Lenin lived. After Lenin died, he would need a new way to control him. The Mausoleum was that way. And that is where the final part of this investigation must go.